Okay, good morning. We're reaching slowly the end of the semester in the class, so one more to go after this one. And we now finally have reached the realism, that's the other end of the class. Realism that has existed for quite a long time. And before I go on with it, on your email, you saw a disclaimer that online I had to cut one image because it's a very provocative image. And I didn't want, as the Zoom session is the one that is recorded and is going to go on YouTube, I didn't want to face being censored. And they can put me off of YouTube and the whole school forever. They can, they might not. It's so unclear that I cannot, I don't want to take the risk. All the outfits like Facebook, YouTube and others have changed their policy. Facebook was very severe at the time, but then they had so many problems with art history teachers and with artists that they had to change their views, but I'm not sure up to what. So I gave people online the way to go and see the picture by themselves. And then we will also see, oh, sorry. Maman, je donne une classe. Maman. Maman. Je donne une classe aujourd'hui.
Ah, pardon.
Okay. Anyway, so as we will see, you will have a view from a newspaper far away. For you, the people in class will have it in great dimension, and you're allowed not to look if you don't want to. So that's
what I came for.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, realism is a style that existed from a long time ago, and we can literally go back to the caves and imagine that people were trying to show you what was happening around them. But in the art we are familiar with, we can go back, for example, to that beautiful miniature of Simon. No, this one is the Van Eyck. Sorry, why did I pass one? Yes, probably by Jan van Eyck is an illumination showing the baptism of Christ. When we talk about a bas de page, that means you had a page, and then there was that kind of small miniature at the bottom of the page. So you would probably have a text, and that was considered as a bas de page. Let me mute people. I'm sorry, I didn't do that. Mute. Oh, come on.
Please check the driving.
Mute. Oh, there we are. So here we see, in fact, Christ, and we know that for many, this would not be a reality. But all the scene that we see on the right and the landscape and so on are very realistic. And that is what we want to emphasize. The same thing with Simon Benning, who was a wonderful Antwerpener, a great artist in illumination. And here he is in 1550, which is a few years before Peter Bruegel came with the Labor of the Months. Here is a very good example of a very naturalistic and realistic representation of peasants going on to their labor. In the 17th century, of course, Velázquez, with his early work of the Water Cellar of Seville, or back in Flemish country, Adriaan Brouwer, who was unfortunately a short-lived artist, and who, for example, really was interesting to Rubens even. in these incredibly realistic views of peasants fighting in tavern. You know, they had a little too much to drink or whatever, and then they would start a brawl. So very realistic paintings then. In France, we have the Lenain brothers, 3 brothers who were specialized in these. And this was really an exception right then for in the artistic world, but really representing these very, how can I say, realistic scenes of peasants. And this was not usual at that time, where they would rather show what's happening at the court or in the rich bourgeois setting, but very typical of the Lenain, who worked typically together. Very often we can find 3 hands in their works, sometimes 2, very rarely just one of them. But as you can see, the realism is even more emphasized by that kind of palette that is purely brown and ochres. Later on in France, in the 18th century, just coexisting at the same time with the frivolous Rococo painters, we find a painter like Chardin, who is going to show us many, it's these wonderful paintings, but very often we have these very simple scenes of either servants or peasants or people of, you know, living in a modest environment, and making it so precious with the detail and the very lovely palette. This is directly inspired from the Teniers family in Belgium at that time. But it's very quiet, very pretty. So I'm bringing back a map. So you have an idea of how Europe looked at the time, whereas the gray is the Kingdom of Sardinia. So you have that part, it's the southeastern part of France and northwestern part of what is not yet Italy at the time, and then the island of Sardinia. What is interesting is here the Kingdom of Prussia, separated in 2 entities, and then of course the Austrian Empire. But we have to realize that by that time, the 19th century is going to be very important, because it's going to see the decline of the Austrian Empire and the making of what is now Germany, where Prussia is going to push and really try to absorb all the small states that existed in Germany, over 300 states, and little by little absorb them. And then you have big places like Bavaria, and you will have other states that are going to resist Prussia, but finally they decide to get all together and make a confederation. And that happens about the same time as Italy, by the way, at the end of the 19th century. So again, to set us in that period, we have to realize that we've just passed the Enlightenment, but it has had tremendous influence on what's happening in the countries, even in the 19th century. Enlightenment really happens in the 18th century, but will be concluded with the French Revolution, which is going to change absolutely everything. So on the economic point of view, we have the Industrial Revolution that started in England and came kind of late in France because of the revolution and all the various small revolution that happened during the beginning of the 19th century. We also have Napoleon that follows the French Revolution, but then we have, of course, Charles X, who's going to be toppled and then replaced by Louis Philippe, and then Louis Philippe himself is going to be kicked out in 1848. Then Napoleon III takes over, and he makes a coup and becomes emperor in 1850. So all these things, you know, when you fight constantly, you don't have the time to implement all these industries. So England was far ahead, and even Germany was too. What's going to happen, though, is that the agricultural world is going to become partly industrialized, which is going to help the peasants. But then there are a whole series of inventions which are going to kick up the Industrial Revolution, like the steam engine, the discovery of iron and steel, the use of iron and steel in buildings and other industries. And then very important is the invention of the Jacquard loom. The Jacquard loom is in fact the ancestor of the computer. It was on a perforated sheet that would automatize, if you want, the weaving process. And so it's quite interesting. We'll see a picture in a minute. As far as the social world is concerned, we have, of course, the Industrial Revolution again, which is going to use people in different ways. Suddenly, people that were used to the agricultural world are thrown in, if you want, in manufacturers and so on, and often in very pitiful condition, particularly early on in England. There is therefore a migration to cities, because typically these industries were on the outskirts of the cities. So people leave the countryside and come to the cities. And so it creates a new working class. Politically, we have, of course, the existence of Karl Marx and Angelus, who are going to produce the Communist Manifesto in 1848, which is going to have a great impact on the social side and on the political. And for us, first convention for women's rights. Then that's going to really lead to the recognition of the fact that we are individual too, and little by little is going to bring us to the rights of voting. So we talked about century of invention, and you see on the right an image of the Jacquard loom. And so you can see these perforated sheet that very much mimic what is going to become the perforated cards in the early large computer, IBM computers. So we have the invention of electricity in the 1750s, steam engine 1770s, telegraph, the whole progression to a real telegraph between 1775 and 1837, Jacquard loom in 1805, photography 1826, railroad 1830. And that's going to just go on. The more you have this invention, the more they're going to call for more invention. And we know that at the turn of the 20th century, we have cars, airplanes, and so on, and telephone. So imagine yourself in the shoes of somebody that lives at that time. It has changed the landscape, if you want, of the way people live. And so these are quite interesting. Coming back to art, we have now that contrast between the early Romanticism that starts in the early part of the 18th century, and that was, as you remember, kind of remote and exotic, loved heroes. They were trying to stress heroic imagery, either by great landscape, the sublime landscape that we saw in Germany, for example, and all the way to the US, but also they love the hero, Bonaparte. Other big figureheads are really important. That is replaced now by very concrete and matter-of-fact depiction of everyday life. So imagine the difference. That's really, you come back to Earth and you suddenly look at the realities, which are not always very beautiful of life. So the nostalgic landscape and heroic themes of the Romantic period is going to be replaced by confronting experiences and appearances of their own time, consequences of industrialism and lives of ordinary people. And that had been called for, by the way, by many authors during the end of the 18th century, where they were trying to reform the existing painters. They say, come on, look around you. Life is not all these frivolous, lovely little things that we see. There are lots of people that are hungry, that suffer, or are working hard. And so we'll see, particularly with the two painters we're going to see today, there will be a follow-up once we start the second part of the 19th century in September, where I'll bring some more realists like Daumier and more smaller figures, but quite important too. So as you know, we will see that that will move slowly to what Impressionism is going to do, which is showing city street scenes and or everyday little picnic here and there, but much more realistic. The first figure that I want to introduce you to is Jean-François Millet. He was born in 1814 at the village of Gruchy in Normandy, and was sent to Cherbourg to study with a portrait painter at the age of 19, am I right? Yeah. He moved to Paris a few years later and studies at the École des Beaux-Arts with Paul Delaroche, who is a known teacher at that time at the Academy. In 1841, he marries Pauline Virginie Honneau in Cherbourg, but she dies 2 years later, unfortunately. And so he remarries 4 years later, 2 years later, sorry, and marries Catherine Lemaire in a civil ceremony, and he will have 9 children with her, which was pretty typical at the time because so many were dying in childhood. In mid-1840s, he befriends Troyon, Diaz, Jacques, Rousseau, and Daumier, who we will see in September. Troyon and Diaz are both part of the Barbizon group. And so he's meeting these people that have similar ideas with him. And he will move in 1849 to Barbizon, where he becomes kind of a leader of these young painters who want to show reality, and in particular are going to paint in the plein air. I'm going to, at that time, take advantage of the new invention of the little tube with paint inside that didn't exist before. And they now can take their canvas and the easel and their painting and then literally paint on the spot. So 1849, he moves to Barbizon, which is part of the Fontainebleau forest, southeast of Paris. In 1870, he flees the Franco-Prussian War. It goes to the western part of France in Cherbourg. And then finally, in 1875, he marries Catherine in a religious ceremony and dies 2 weeks later in Barbizon. So what we will see with him is mostly scenes of peasants, very hard workers. And what we should observe is how he's modeling these peasants. And we're going to see that he really simplifies the shapes. The face is not important to him. It's the position, the effort, the tension of the whole scene. And in that way, it looks influenced by Daumier, who precedes him just by a couple of years and who we will see again in September. Very difficult to work in 3Ds in art history because so many figures come about the same time. So this first version of the winnower was presented at the Salon during the Salon of 1848. At the same time as another painting that I'm not even showing to you, which is the Captivity of the Jews of Babylon. That was a history painting. And if you remember what I mentioned to you, is the fact that there is a hierarchy of genres at the Academy, where typically at the top of the hierarchy, you have history painting. Any painters who wanted to be legitimate had to produce one of these large canvas showing a scene that goes back to the Bible or the Roman history or anything that really makes sense in the history with noble values. And that would set you up. Once you had done that, you were considered as a legitimate painter. Just his paintings, such as this one, would not have qualified for it. And he would have been looked at a kind of a minor genre painter, not as a big painter. So the captivity of the Jews in Babylon was in fact intended to attract buyers, and would really mark Millet, who by now would have sold a painting. And then he was a little freer to go his own way, if you want. So mostly what he's going to produce are paintings of peasant daily life. He completely turns away from the literary and artistic reference that were used typically at that time. So he will actually produce two other versions of the same that are on display at the Musée d'Orsay, and another one in another French museum. As you can see here, the winner is dressed in his working clothes with clogs on his feet. He's using a van and blows up the grain to separate it from the straw. So very, again, if you look at it, the face is barely shown. It's in the dark and it's not detailed. If you, what is important for him is what he's doing and within what context. The very known, the Sower, is so typical of his work. And there we see immediately, and you will understand that the influence of Daumier, very strong delineation. As you can see, there is really a kind of a brown contour of the figure, but beautiful use of color and a very beautiful movement where he makes that Sower a real hero. It gives him heroic dimension. So by that time in 1850, he had an arrangement with patron of his, Sancier, who gave him material and money to be able to paint in return for drawings and paintings that he would give him. But also he was free to continue selling works to other buyers as well. And then you can see the scene is very simple, but so much emphasizing the dignity of the man. This, by the way, was very influential on Van Gogh, who absolutely adored it. He really idolized what Millet was doing. So again, we have that symbol of that very hard work. And when you look at these women, again, you can barely see their face, but you can feel the weight of the load they are carrying around. And also emphasize the idea of humility. In 1867, the Exposition Universelle, universal exhibition that would take care every year in a different country or every 5 years, depending on how. They hosted a major showing of his work, and this one was part of it, as well as the Angelus that we will see and the Gleaners later on. And again, here you see peasants working in the plains, and this was pretty close to Barbizon, where he was residing at that time. So you can, when you see that, imagine you are part of the rich bourgeois, you can really understand the struggle that these peasants had to survive. The way he paints also, you can't see it on the screen, but he's using very coarse brushwork that really kind of rattles you when you see it. This is the other one, very famous, the Gleaners, that was a part of that group that he exhibited at the Exposition Universelle. And some people claim it's romanticized. I don't think so. I think it's very real. And the Gleaners were the poorest of the poorest. They would come after the harvest and pick up whatever was left on the ground. So these really people that had absolutely nothing. But you have the beautiful light at the back that softens a little bit the scene with the haystacks and the farm in the background where you know that people are living better, but they allow these women to come and just take as little as they can to bring back some food at home. This, by the way, the theme of the Gleaners is something that goes back into the Bible. Then the third piece is the Angelus that was commissioned by Thomas Gold Appleton, an American art collector that was based in Boston, Massachusetts. He had studied with one of Millet's friends, Constant Troyon. And when it was completed, for whatever reason, the collector didn't take the painting after all. And so it changed hands quite a bit. And really interesting because it was not such a popular painting. The price only increased very modestly in value. Also because many people were suspecting that Millet had odd political sympathies. And so they didn't want, it was the beginning of communism and so on. So you had socialist movements. So at his death a decade later, there was a bidding war between the US and France. And they ended up paying the price of 800,000 gold francs for the painting. So suddenly it jumped into value. And this, of course, really triggered something new in the law system, where they found that the surviving family of Millet at that time sued the people in saying, come on, you kept artificially the price low. And then suddenly, now that it's out of our hands, the price went so much. And so there's in France what is called le droit de suite, that intends to compensate artists or their heirs when the works are resold at very high value. So they're allowed to get some of it. And again, you can almost hear just nothing, just hear the bell of the Angelus. The time you have the church, the profile of a church in the background here. And so this is where the sound is coming. And so they just take that second to stop and pray. He did also a few evening and or night scene. This is the ship phone, where you see the waning moon that throws that very mysterious light across the plain. This is still close to Barbizon. So he's bringing back the sheep in the pen to prevent the predators to go after them. And then a very interesting work that seems to be the last one he painted with the hunting birds at night. And this is something he had witnessed. It's young people would go close to where pigeons were staying at night. And then they would come with that very blinding light and start making lots of noise, and the pigeons would take off and they would club them and kill them so that they could bring them back home for food. The most important figure of the realist movement is, of course, Gustave Courbet, quite an incredible personality. As it was said of him, he belonged to no school, to no church, to no institution, to no academy, least of all to any regime except the regime of liberty. And that's going to be, unfortunately for him, his demise, cause his demise. So he was born in Ornans in 1819 to an anti-monarchical household. So he was in total agreement with the revolution. In 1839, he went to Paris and worked at the studio of Steuben and Hess, and spent most of his time going to the Louvre and look at Spanish, Flemish, and French masters. He traveled between 1846 and 47 to the Netherlands and Belgium, and really took a lot of inspiration from the Flemish and Dutch painters that were very strong at that time in genre paintings and landscapes. In 1855, he inaugurated the Pavillon du Réalisme to exhibit his refused works. The way it was, as you know, you had the salon once a year, and you could submit your works to hope that they would be hanging at the salon, because this is where the painters were making their first sales and they were making their reputation. This is where everybody would come and look at the paintings. And to have even one work hanging at the salon was such a success. But the jury that was vetting the works was extremely rigorous and especially respectful of the customs of the academy. So they didn't want anybody to just wander outside of the standards of the academy. And at first, Courbet's works were refused, one after the other. And once he was accepted for one, they literally hung it in such a way that nobody could see his work. So he was very cross with them. So he actually worked with some friends of his and made in a much smaller venue, a pavilion of realism painting where he could hang the painting. So this is prior to Manet and the Salon des Refusés. So this is really, when you look at Courbet, if there had not been Courbet, I don't think that Manet would have existed. But interestingly enough, Manet is more known in general than Courbet. In 1871-72, he receives a sentence of 6 months in prison to have ordered the demolition of the Colonne Vendôme. If you have been to Paris, there is the famous Place Vendôme close to the Rue de Rivoli. And he was part of a group, and he advised, he said, you know, that we should, he claimed that he didn't want it to be demolished, but it should have been moved. And that was his defense. Nobody believed him. But anyway, we'll talk about this in a little bit more. And because he was imprisoned for 2 years, and then the new president decided that they were going to rebuild the Colonne Vendôme, and that Courbet was going to be the one to pay for it. And that was an astronomical price. And Courbet didn't have the means at all. So he went on self-imposed exile in Switzerland to avoid bankruptcy. He came to more or less an agreement towards a couple of years later, but died the day before he was supposed to put down the first installment. And so that was the end of the story. He died at the age of 58 in Switzerland. He was very much influenced by the literature of the time, as were many artists. And we can only talk about a few of them: Honoré de Balzac with the Comédie Humaine, human comedy; Flaubert, Madame Bovary. You all heard of the Madame Bovary, the very sad story of the woman who is kind of dreaming of having a great lover and who is going to end up dying, never having really met the love of her life. Baudelaire, Les Fleurs du Mal, so that's a series of poems, absolutely beautiful poems that were not that dangerous when you look at it, but in the mentality of the time, were far too free in thoughts. Flowers of Evil. And then Zola, of course, Émile Zola, Thérèse Raquin, and Les Rougeons Macquart. Again, these are all poetry and writings that are talking about real life and real sad stories, or in general, they're rather sad, but showing the reality of what was happening around them. So, and here are some portraits. He was a very good portrait painter. On the left, the portrait of Hector Berlioz, the great composer of the time. Actually, he didn't like the portrait by Courbet that he thought was lacking either in feeling or identifying attributes of his trade. The fact that he was a composer, he should have shown some papers with notes or whatever. That was the tradition. And so Courbet broke with the tradition. On the right is a portrait of Baudelaire, the writer. And Baudelaire not only wrote poems, by the way, but he was quite an important art critic and wrote lots of journals about doing the critiques of the Salon, for example. Every time there was a Salon, he would have his own critique, and that was published. We find in Courbet what you wouldn't call really egocentrism, but a research of who he was all his life. So at first, there's many young painters, he includes himself in many of the paintings. And so this is the Lovers or the Vase painting that represents him with his mistress of the time. But as it was, he was from a pretty decent family. He didn't ever talk about her as being the mistress. She was a model, but in fact, they did have a relationship. And she appears in many of the early paintings of his. And you can see his palette is beautiful with a lot of contrast, but very delicate in some of the nuance. He also shows, and that's where we see his realism. This is actually after the dinner at Ornans. Ornans, remember, is the place where he was born. And this shows his father and some of his friends having a dinner, and then you have one of them taking a fiddle and playing the fiddle to entertain them during these late hours. It's really interesting because Ornans was really in the middle of nowhere. And it's interesting that his parents are going to really work their best to help him. And they're going to build a big hangar where that's going to become his workshop, and where he's going to be able to paint his very large canvas that he's going to show later on. This, by the way, is not small. It's more than life size. So it's almost 2 meters by 2.5. So it's a large work. And this is, again, something that would put off the people from the academy, because these large formats were normally reserved for history painting. And this had absolutely no claim of history. It was just a very simple scene. An extraordinary work is the Stone Breakers, that unfortunately was destroyed during the bombing of Dresden in 1945, and is one of his first great work. Courbet is mentioning the fact that he saw them on the street breaking stones, and say it's not often that one encounters so complete an expression of poverty. And so right then and there, I got the idea for a painting. I told them to come to my studio the next morning. What is interesting when you look at that, you have on the left a young man who's too young to do that work. And he's working to get, this was some of the hardest work that you could do, is break the stones on the side of the road to make it a road. And the other one is too old to do what he's doing. And it really shows the unfairness of the poor that had not too many choice in the kind of job they could do. Definitely, it has an impact of socialist ideas and class of work. One of his first very large canvas, it's 10 by 21 feet. So when you go to the Musée d'Orsay, there's a room that is dedicated to Courbet where his huge canvases are shown, and this is one of them. It shows a burial, just a regular burial of a person from his village of Ornans. He started that painting just after he finished the Stone Breakers, and actually had to invite half of the village in his studio to complete it, because there he shows the face. There are some portraits there of people that he knew. But he shows there a very simple scene of a village that comes around. And if you've ever lived in a village or in a small town, you know that that's the way it was. You would, somebody would die, you might not even be very privy to the person, but it was that custom, you had to go and participate. That was just a question of honor and courtesy. So you see that everybody is in black except for the two clerics in the center. He's using something also interesting, is it doesn't give any prominence to any of the people that are represented, that kind of isocephaly, the same level of the heads. There are 50 life-size figures with a background of just a very simple landscape and the sky. As you've seen, the size of the canvas, it's huge. For him, it was a picture of human figures and a historical record of a burial at Ornans. You can barely see the coffin. It's coming there on the left, but the hole is already there. And in the very center, you have the grave digger who is there, having prepared the hole for the dead. And as I say, most of these people were in his studio, so they used the kind of portrait. But there is no sentimentality. I mean, from the men's side, they're all pretty straight face. Typically, women are shown crying, but in a very sober manner. Of the same period is the famous meeting, or Bonjour, Monsieur Courbet, that shows Courbet himself on the right, meeting his favorite patron at the time, who was Alfred Bruyat, and his servant Calas, as well as the dog that was traveling. And they come, Bruyat takes his hat off. It looks like Courbet didn't have his hat on. The way he holds it shows that he already was holding it by that time. And the critiques were pretty severe when that painting was shown in 1855, where they ridiculed it by naming it Bonjour, Monsieur Courbet, and mentioning the fact that Courbet didn't even have a vest on and didn't wear his hat. So he was really kind of, again, against the grain of the normal protocol, if you want, that was existing, if we can talk about etiquette. This was actually influenced, in a sense, by the bourgeois de la ville parlant aux Juifs errants, the wandering Jew, the whole legend of the wandering Jew. And you can see here a print of the burghers of the city talking to the wandering Jew. And down below there, you have a scene that kind of is, kind of similar to what Courbet did. So here is a caricature of the painting where it says, Leçon de politesse. So this is a lesson of politeness given by Mr. Courbet to two burghers. At the site of Mr. Courbet, the burghers take off only their hats. At the sight of the burghers, Mr. Courbet takes his hat off, his jacket, and his vest. So it's kind of the kind of humor that they were showing. But Courbet loved women. And so he is going to show a lot of paintings of women. Courbet also mentioned the fact that for him, he was only painting what he would see. And he was completely opposed to any symbolism, angels and cherubs and other things that were the pure invention of painters. He was completely against it. So he really insisted on the fact he wanted to paint only what he saw. When this painting came up, Les Baigneuses, the bathers, in 1853, Delacroix, the painter Delacroix, told his newspaper guy that he was amazed at the vigor and prominence of this work, but he reproached it for the vulgarity of the forms, and worse still, the vulgarity and uselessness of thought. And this is really where Courbet breaks with the others. He's not looking at a moral message. He's not looking at symbolic values. He's looking, okay, there's that girl that is getting ready to go into the river, and she's just undressing, and the other one, for whatever, is either shocked or is pushing somebody away. But she has very Rubenian shapes. When you know Rubens' works from the back, this looks like a Rubens, and Delacroix loved Rubens. So it's really interesting is the fact that there was no implicit value in there. And so therefore it was not legitimate, if you want. So the critics agreed with Delacroix and said that they critiqued the neglected nature of the scene, the massive character of the nude in opposition to the official canons. But anyway, his friend Alfred Bruyas, who you saw the representation earlier, bought the painting, and that allowed Courbet to become financially and artistically independent. So again, what is scandalous for the people here is the format. It's a large painting, not huge, but large, usually reserved for religion or for divinities. And here it shows a nude that is not even legitimate. It's not Venus, it's not any goddess, it's just a regular woman. Despite his hate for any symbolism, he's going to produce this extremely large painting too. This is 3.5 meters by almost 6 meters. So a huge painting too, the same room at the Musée d'Orsay, by the way. And that shows the studio of the painter. Delacroix admired that workshop for the beautiful details that Courbet was providing. But he denounced that preference for detail to the detriment of the imagination of the realism of Courbet. Again, there is that criticism about what is the value, the moral value within that painting. And this is really what Courbet didn't care for. And even Baudelaire, who was very much ahead of his time, that had actually compared Courbet and Ingres, said in here, the imagination, this queen of the faculties, has faded away. It certainly saw in Courbet a powerful workman, a savage and patient will, but anti-supernaturalist who wage a war on the imagination. And so considered that the philosophy of brutes and criticized him for the poverty of ideas. And it's always that research of these moral ideas that was so implemented in the academy. So he began to work on that large painting in 1854. And the way he described it, he said, "I see society with its concerns and passions. It is the world that comes to be painted. The scene takes place in my atelier in Paris. The painting is divided into two parts. I'm in the middle painting. On the right are the shareholders, so all the rich people that make him survive, actually. That is friends, workers, devotees of the art world. On the left, the other world of trivial life, the people, misery, poverty, wealth, the exploited and the exploiters, the people who live off death." So this is really the idea. So what he's trying to present is an overall image of the role of art, but stressed his autonomy and subjectivity in his perception in the face of history. It was a success at the exposition, but didn't find a buyer and remained rolled up in a corner until his sister Juliette, after his death, decided to sell it. It raised the equivalent of 3,200 euros at the time. And it's only in 1920 that it was acquired by the Louvre and found its way to the Musée d'Orsay, 60 years later. And here is a blow-up of showing the figure that represents art, next, looking at the beautiful landscape by Courbet.
So what is the small child and the nude? These are other.
He's looking at who is doing it. This is part of the environment. He's part of the left.
Okay.
He's part of the left group. You know, he's a poor kid, and he's just admiring it. You don't have to look very far for symbolism with him because there's none. Yeah, the real title was, let me get, that's a mistake. Sorry, I should have. Real Allegory of 7 years. Let me see if I have the titles. Of 7 years of painting, I think. He came with this painting that also was very provocative. It doesn't look provocative to us, but if you look well at the young lady, she's showing her underwear, the undergarment. And this was not allowed at the time. So they assumed that to show that they must be prostitute that he depicted there. So they are relaxing on the banks of the Seine. They are inactive but provocative because of the fact that they show the ankle and the undergarment, and so therefore liable to all kinds of sexual interpretation. But it's beautiful when you look at it, the details again. He's very much detail oriented. Here is the sketch he did for the young woman at the top. So you can see how much he changed once he came to the final product. And the same for the younger woman at the front that originally was in a brown. And I think the white dress is so much more becoming. So I don't know for what I have a double representation of that. So I'm moving this over. And sometimes just to be able to sell some works, he would also put some hunting scenes. And this is an example of painting that is, I think, is that Winslow Homer who did that painting of the fox. It's very reminiscent of that, but it shows some of these hunting scenes. In this case, the fox in the snow who is hunting the little rodents. And they were very good sellers. People loved these works. he became really, in a sense, the center of irony for many caricaturists. Here you see Master Courbet inaugurating the workshop of the modern painters. And modern at that time is not a compliment. We have to see that it's really a demeaning adjective. And you see him on a bull with a brush in his hand and trampling the academic world, coming with these very different type of works. As I mentioned, he really loved women and really produced some rather interesting works. This is a work made in 1866, The Woman with the Parrot, was presented at the Salon, and again was heavily criticized for a lack of taste due to the model's non-academic pose and her disheveled hair. So at that time, if you knew the academic rules, this was not at all a way you would present somebody. She's not a goddess. She's not part of the Bible. So there's no excuse to show a nude. And so again, he's ahead of Manet. When you think of the tolle that we had with Manet and his Venus, au déjeuner sur l'herbe, this is ahead of it. And he's really going to prepare the terrain for Manet. But very pretty painting. And of course, that woman has extraordinary hair that are spread around her head. And he really contrasts with the background, that beautiful light colored flesh. He did at about the same time the other painting. It's almost like a pendant for it. And unfortunately, it's in black and white for the good reason it was destroyed also during the war in Berlin. And it shows here that this is the réveil, so the waking up, or also called Venus and Psyche. And so it's really interesting because it shows two women that normally are not shown together. You have Eros and Psyche, but Venus and Psyche is a rare setting. And again, it's a very similar pose, probably the same model that was used for the woman on the bed. And again, there he's challenging the academicism. He's showing his own codes, the dimension again, and the vision of the painting. So what were these academic conventions in art? You had this, I mentioned before, the hierarchy of genres, the fact that you had to produce a history painting to be really considered a high-level painter. The size of the work was relative to the subject matters that you use. So very large canvas were really kept for these type of paintings, for history paintings. And Courbet is going to just turn that around. Nudes have to relate to mythology or biblical figures to be legitimate. You were not showing nudes on any other way. And they had to follow the academic paths that were found either in classical sculpture or some part of some of the emblem books. So he went on, despite all the critiques, he produced this painting that really stressed the public a lot, as you can imagine, and shows the sleep, showing two women sleeping together. And according to the critiques, according to the scholars, the fact that you have some pins and some other works on the right would show that they had some sexual intercourse between them. it's really interesting when you know the severity of the censorship at the time. But because of criticism about him, Napoleon's regime in 61, who had in 61 shown the very strict press censorship and censorship on painters, decided to make some more concession and show that he was more liberal than he was accused to be. And so this really changed the way the press worked, as well as artists. And so even to show an appeasement to Courbet, he offered him the Legion of Honor in 1870, and Courbet refused the thing because he didn't consider Napoleon as a legitimate leader. So this work in particular was commissioned, and that's really the interesting point, by a Turkish diplomat and art collector of the late Ottoman era. His name was Halil Serif Pasha, who had lived in Paris since the 1860s. And he had a whole series of paintings by Ingres and by Courbet, and the famous one that I'm going to show you afterwards also was one that belonged to him. And it was so much that this work was exhibited in 72. It became the subject of a police report. What is also very interesting is that one of the two models, the one with the lighter hair, was actually the mistress of Whistler. And while Whistler was traveling, she had come to Paris and had met Courbet and had become temporarily the mistress of Courbet. And she's going to be the center of many of his paintings. And here she is, portrait of the Belle Irlandaise, as they call her. Her name was Johanna Heffernan. She's going to go back to London. Whistler is going to cut all ties with Courbet, but she's going to re-enter his household for a couple of years. Then they're finally going to terminate that for good, but she will be his full heir when he died. She was actually not only his model, but she was also taking care of his administration. Very pretty girl that I'm showing you too. She's the subject of this work by Whistler, Symphony in White #1. It's the same girl. And Courbet will paint a couple of these portrait of Jo, or La Belle Irlandaise, the pretty Irish woman. Now comes the painting, which I'm not showing online, but I'm going to pass it on to you in small version. So you can look at the center one on the left. I'm coming to you in a minute, and with a paper, so you will understand why I cannot. So this is the origin of the world. And as you can imagine, that was a first. Also commissioned, by the way, by the same Muslim guy. And this is so appalling when you know how the whole religious side, where women cannot even show their face and so on. But he had a whole collection of works, including this one.
She's not showing.
But no, she's not, though. No, originally there's great chance she was, and I'm coming to it. That painting, which is very in your face, as you can see, was incredible, but was never exhibited until 1988. And in 1988, she was shown for the first time, and to the great excitement of many art scholars, and has remained a kind of revolutionized moment for us. It's really interesting because if you look at it crudely, it's the first time that you can see that, and especially if you think of a Muslim person, women were completely plucked in the East. So to see that pubic hair is even more interesting in a sense. to the point that if you know Ruskin, the great art critic in London, when he got married, was horrified because he discovered the pubic hair of his wife and never touched her. The marriage was never consummated. He hated it. So I'm going to relieve your eyes and show you the next image. The next image shows you in the Musée d'Orsay because it's exhibited totally normally. It's not a large painting. But what is interesting is recently they discovered this part of it, which seems to be very much part of the painting. And it shows that as the painting was never seen by other people than the buyer, and it changed hand many times, it ended up in the hands of a great, very known psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan, in Paris. And it looks like somewhere in between, the painting was cut. And so you can see here the face of a woman, the face that is, you can barely see, would have been part of the painting. And so this would have been a larger painting. It looked very small for Courbet, the format. Now, some people disagree. They have all kind of agreement that the threads of the canvas correspond, that the pigments are completely compatible. But so it would have shown, which is interesting. If you look at the right, that on that newspaper, it makes it, I think, less shocking than if you just see the bottom part of the body. But so this, as you can imagine, was quite a revolutionary work and shows that nothing would stop him. So now I relieve you completely, you can breathe again. And I'm going to show you some of the very pretty landscape works that he did too, all around Ornans, where he lived with his parents. And this is the oak at Flagey, or the oak of Vercingétorix. Vercingétorix being one of the great Gauls that fought the Romans. And so this oak is supposed to be more than 1,000 years old. And he represented absolutely beautifully in the very center of the canvas.
Is it still alive? Can you go and see it?
I would assume it is. I haven't heard that it isn't. Here again, very close to where he was, that stream. Very vigorous palette and broken brush strokes, very typical of his work of the time on landscape. And then he made a whole series of waves. He went to the northern part of France, close to Étretat, and did a whole series. And the museum here in Phoenix has one of his waves. This is another one in the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Lyon, and showing the beautiful sky with that storm approaching. He was apparently fascinated by the power of the sea. So then came the famous story of the column Vendôme. So this you can see, this is that famous square where the Cartier store is in Paris. And I'm going to try to move that here, yes. So as he said himself, inasmuch as the Vendôme column is a monument devoid of all artistic value, tending to perpetuate by its expression of ideas of war and conquest of the past imperial dynasty, which are reproved by a Republican nation sentiment, Citizen Courbet expresses the wish that the National Defense Government will authorize him to disassemble this column. So that was his statement. That's going to cost him so much, because they're going to take the column and topple it. On top of the column was a statue of Napoleon. And of course, for the people at the time, Napoleon was an usurpator. The column had been started in 1806 at Napoleon's direction and completed in 1810. It was, of course, modeled after the Trajan column and was celebrating the victory at Austerlitz. It has 425 spiraling bas-relief bronze plate. And these were made out of cannons that were taken from the combined armies of Europe. So there he is imprisoned, but they let him paint. They bring an easel, but he cannot have any model. So what he's going to do a series of still lifes. He can have fruits and other vegetables. And so he's going to spend 6 months in prison to have ordered that. And then he will go back to Ornans. And then when Macmahon, the new president, decided he has to pay for the whole rebuilding of the column, he realizes he doesn't have the money at all, so he would be put back in prison for that. And so he decides to self-exile to Switzerland. And he's going to produce, the date I think is wrong for that one because it corresponds to the time he's in Switzerland. And he made many of these trouts that had been caught that showed typically some blood coming in. They say that it's kind of a comparison to his condition. Here is a painting he did of the chalet that he was living in Switzerland. So very simple little house. He apparently was surveilled by the Swiss intelligence service. And you can understand why, because he was a troublemaker in France. And so, but he enjoyed in that little place there were some other artists, and he made some friends and was doing fine, I think drinking a lot. So here's a picture of him with some of his Swiss friends. He's the one in the middle with the beard. And then, of course, I think he couldn't resist the Alps. So he did a lot of landscapes too. And here are the Dents du Midi, which is a series of very pointed peaks in the southern part of the Alps. Beautiful image and very pretty sky. As I mentioned, he did lots of self-portrait, and it's not considered that he was so self-centered, but more, as they say, trying to find his own identity. So it's really, I put them all together because I think it's really interesting to see how he evolves. In 1842, as a young man, there's a similar painting by Rembrandt with half of the face in the shadow when Rembrandt was very young. So I don't know if he had seen it, but it really seems very similar. And then with his dog, he had that black dog, a Cocker Spaniel, that he really loved. As you can see, he was a rather handsome guy. But it's all very posed, you know, there is nothing natural. Then he worked on the next one for 2 or 3 years before he finished it. And it's almost like you have the feeling he's an insane actor. And sleeping, 1844 to 54, so it took him a long time also. Then you have that whole series. The one with the pipe is really beautiful, I think, in 1848, 49, and 1854. So he died rather young, at 57, probably of liver cirrhosis. He was drinking a lot then. He was very isolated and probably looking back at his career as being a loss because he was never fully appreciated during his lifetime, except by the avant-garde. So as I mentioned, I couldn't insert, I would have loved to insert Daumier there, but it's too much to say about Daumier, so he will have his class by himself in September. And I think we'll come back to Courbet from time to time to understand. So next time we'll talk about international realism, where we look at Norway, Denmark, and Russia. This is a part of a painting by Verhaeghen, who is one of the most incredible realist painters of the time, that is really criticizing not only the Russians, but also the Turks for the cruelty they show in their wars. He's traveled a lot, so his paintings are very varied, and he's totally unknown here, and I really wanted to stress that. So I hope you've seen the big steps, the giant steps we did for 9 months, and the international realism is going to conclude that before we move beyond 1850. We have already, but let's say where to start with, and also I'll soon publicize the next program, which is going to be rather incredible for the fall. On Thursday, we'll have from 1850 to 1900. So we're going to touch the continuation of realism, the Barbizon, the Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and Art Nouveau. So imagine the program in the pre-Raphaelite. We're going to have a huge program for that. And for the Tuesday, we'll have Flemish and Dutch painting in the 17th century. So it's really quite interesting program, hopefully. If you have any question, I'm going to stop the recording.